So my name is Wendy Roberts. I have been working as a practice mentor on the Effective Child Protection Project in Gwynedd. The project was initially funded for 2 years by the North Wales Regional Transformation Board for us to be able to look really at improving practice with children and families, trying to make that work more effective and trying to see what we can do as practitioners to develop our skills in that area and to work more collaboratively with children and families. So the project does have four main elements, which are conversations, threshold, change and measure, and they come together to form the model. But underlying that, what we found through doing the project was that there was an underlying principle of reflective practice which we were keen to explore further.
My name's Siobhan McLean. I'm a registered social worker, but most of my work now revolves around training social workers and students and writing about practice. And generally, the areas that I'm very interested in are reflective practice and theory and practice. And so I've been doing some work alongside of Wendy, co-working across the project to look at embedding reflective practice more in supervision and in day-to-day practice. I think what is reflective practice is actually it's a much more complicated question than it seems on the face of it, isn't it? Because it's so layered. It's so reflection and reflective practice. There are so many layers to it, really. On a very basic level, it's just about thinking, thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it and after you've done it. It's just about constantly thinking about your practice and the work that you're doing. But then on a deeper level, it's about taking into account values, issues and bias that you might have in your work and thinking about what you've learned from it and thinking about change and how to bring about change. And it's thinking about, on an even deeper level, it's really starting to bring about self-awareness. So you start to think about yourself and the impact that you've had on the situation, the impact the situation has had on you. Why do you see it in this way and another person sees it in another way? It's all of that. So it's so layered in terms of what it is. And I wonder if sometimes it's almost presented as something that's actually quite simple, and it isn't simple. It is quite a layered, complex thing. So I suppose that's my thoughts. What about you, Wendy?
Yeah, I think, like you've said, thinking about it in the layers and the depth is really important because I think reflection can take place at different levels. I think what we need to get to is a point where people are going that bit deeper, going into themselves and working out, kind of unpicking all the different things, like you said, to do with power or anything that might play a part, really. Because I think people can do a lot of surface level reflection, but you need to find that kind of way to go deeper and work out kind of what effect it's having on your practice, why you're doing things. And I think as well, it's about taking that pause and thinking about, okay, what am I going to do differently? Or what can I learn from this? Because it doesn't have to be about just what's gone wrong or what you would do differently. It can be about actually what went well and what you're taking from that so that you are using the good things in your day-to-day practice and you may be changing some of your practice in terms of what hasn't gone so well.
Actually, I think that's really important. And I think if there was one thing that I could change about reflective practice and the way we talk about it and the way it's explored in training and in supervision, is that it does have often a focus on what didn't go well. What should we do differently? And so that can mean it creates a bit of a crisis of confidence for people, and people sometimes become overly self-critical, and quite often people are very in touch with what they need to improve or change, but they're not as in touch with what they do really well and what's been going really well. And I think I suppose especially at the moment when practice is actually so challenging for people and we're in such difficult times, actually kindness in reflection is really important. So being self-kind, thinking about, well, what did go well there, and what did I do well, and what can I carry on doing in that way, I think is as important as looking at what didn't go well, because we need to also build on our strengths. I mean, after all, social work is about strengths-based practice, but that doesn't yet seem to have filtered through into thinking about reflection. Reflection should also be about what's going well, shouldn't it? And self-kindness, I think, is really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that fits in really nicely with what we were trying to do with the project. One of our mottos that we would say often in our training sessions, or when we were talking with workers, would be kind to yourselves. You know, you're doing something new, and it's the same kind of principle with reflection, isn't it? You know, when you're learning new things or you're learning from an experience, you know, it's about being kind with that. You know, we are there to develop and learn and hopefully become practitioners because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the other aspect really around reflection that we've not really talked about is the stages of reflection. So and I think sometimes Shern talks about this, didn't he? He talks about reflection in action and on action. So reflection in action being what you do in the moment as you're thinking about it, you know, thinking in the moment as something's happening. And then reflection on action is what we do later when we're looking back. So thinking about reflecting on what's happened. But one stage of reflection that Shern didn't talk about, and I've only really learnt about in the last few years really, is reflection for action. And that's about thinking ahead, reflecting before we do something. And that reflection for action, really interestingly, comes from engineering, and I've only kind of really learned about this recently, but it comes from engineering, where their view is, you know, we don't build a bridge and then it falls down and then we reflect afterwards on why did it fall down. We actually reflect before, and that's the most important stage of reflection. So we do a lot of the problem solving before the action, and that's the reflecting before. And I think that's such an important stage, but we don't talk about that very much in our social work training. And I think we'd benefit more from, and I don't know about you, but I think perhaps sometimes the more experienced you become as a social worker, the more often we just respond in the moment and run off and do something and just get it done. I think we tend to be, as social workers, really focused on practical skills. You know, people talk about, oh, you did that really well, but nobody ever says, oh, you thought about that really well. So the focus is always on what we do, not what we think. So I wonder if sometimes we jump in and we could spend a bit more time thinking ahead and planning ahead. And that reflection for action for me is perhaps one of the most important stages of reflection, I think.
That's really made me consider in terms of supervision and how we use supervision for reflecting on the work that we've done with people, but how many social workers actually use it to take a step back and think, actually, I want to use this reflection time to plan for my visit with a family. I think social workers can be very good at planning things and thinking about what they need to do, but maybe they don't unpick that and reflect on it and think, why am I doing this with this family, and what do I want to achieve from that session? So maybe spending that time reflecting for action would be really useful.
Yeah. And actually that gives me a connection that I've not thought about before in terms of supervision, because there's some research on supervision that David Wilkins and his team did, and that talks about how a worker should come out of supervision in relation to each family they're working with. They should be able to look at and think about, what am I going to do in the next couple of visits with this family? Why am I doing that? And how am I going to do it? And I think that what, why, and how as a really basic reflective framework could be helpful to reflect for action, you know, as adding into the planning ahead. But planning is more of a kind of description of what I'm going to do, isn't it? Whereas the reflection for action is thinking through the different possibilities. So I think that's made a really good connection there.